Normality, an MLP fanfiction by LuvANerd. It was a sunny day in Ponyville, and all of the residents were about. Rainbow Dash was on her usual route, clearing the clouds. She was zipping towards one of the last ones when a gray blur whizzed past her. She halted suddenly and turned in the direction of the intruder. "Hey, watch where you're going!" she shouted at the stranger. The gray Pegasus stopped abruptly and around. She had a brilliant smile on her face as she attempted to focus both of her wall eyes at the rainbow-maned pony. "I'm sorry, Rainbow Dash. I'm just trying to finish delivering these mails so I can go see Dr. Who's," she chirped excitedly. Rainbow Dash smiled and shook her head with a sigh. "I should have known it was you, Derpy. You're so weird," Artie said with a laugh. "Well, have fun." She caught the blonde-maned Pegasus before rushing towards the last fleeing clouds. Derpy's smile faded as the blue Pegasus grew smaller as she left. She looked towards the village below. "I'm not weird," she muttered as she watched the multiple colors of the ponies on the ground enjoying their day. She looked towards her mailbag and noticed that it was still over halfway full. She sighed at the exasperation at the load. An idea flickered in her mind, and she smirked deviously. "I'm sure the ponies of Ponyville won't need their mail for one day," she said. She lowered herself and flew over a creek until she neared a small stone bridge that allowed the water to run underneath it. She took the strap of her mailbag in her mouth and flung it underneath the bridge. As she soared over it, her face broke into a cheerful smile when she heard the splash of the bag land in the bottom of the creek. She flew back towards the sun and looked around for her dear friend and partner, Dr. Who's. It didn't take her long to notice the brown earth colt standing underneath a large oak tree near the park. They always met there after she finished her rounds. Derpy rushed towards him and took Dr. Who's off guard. He was only able to shout in surprise before he was tackled to the ground with the great Pegasus sitting on top of him. "Hi, Hoovy!" she yelled in his ear, causing him to cringe. "Derpy, what are you doing here so early? I didn't think I'd see you till at least noon," he said, looking up at his companion. She smiled brightly and laughed. "I was about to ask you the same thing," she replied. Dr. Who's looked down sheepishly. "Oh, well, Come on, Hoovy, let's go to our hideout," Derpy yelled, cutting the earth cold off mid-sentence. She jumped off him and trotted towards the oak tree. She kicked aside a small rock and revealed a simple 4-keypad system. She tried to focus on a small square of buttons, but her eyes kept moving, causing her to be unable to see the keypad clearly. Her brow furrowed in frustration, and Dr. Who's quickly walked up beside her and quickly punched the buttons. A fake section of the tree moved aside, revealing a small doorway in the side of the oak tree. The colt smiled at his friend and followed her inside, shutting the doorway behind him. Inside was a small metal room with a red toolbox and a metal table. Blueprints were hung all over the walls, each one displaying a different invention these two ponies had worked on together. Beside the toolbox laid multiple pieces of wood and metal, some rounded while others were shaped like bricks. Dr. Who's walked over to the pieces and smiled, as Derpy decided to read some of her past inventions they had created. Her eyes darted in both directions, skimming over rafts, birdhouses, and ladders, as well as other ideas from a larger hideout for them. Her mind traced back to earlier that day, when she had encountered Rainbow Dash. She frowned and looked at the floor. "Hoovy?" she muttered. Dr. Who's acknowledged her without looking up. "Am I weird?" she asked, holding her breast slightly to prevent from crying. "Well, yeah," he said, looking up at the gray Pegasus. "But everyone's weird. It's what makes up normal." "Normal." Derpy breathed the word in with sudden envy. How long she longed to be normal. Every pony else was the same, but she had to be the only one with messed-up eyes. The only reason she was different was because of her god-awful eyes. "I want to be normal," she said. "You can be normal, silly filly." Dr. Hoosh chuckled and continued working on fitting the multiple pieces together. He had been working on this particular project for weeks. And he told his partner that it was a surprise for her. Derpy's ears perked up at his words. I can?" she asked curiously. "Yeah, why not? It doesn't take a lot of change to become normal," he said. The Pegasus thought hard about his words and looked back at the blueprints. She tried to keep both of her eyes looking in the same direction, but with no avail. "If only I had one eye that was normal," she thought to herself. Suddenly an idea struck her like lightning. The only reason she couldn't focus was because she couldn't focus on only one eye. If she had just had one. Her attention traveled over to the toolbox, and she trotted over to it. Dr. Hooves instinctively hid his invention under his hooves and stared at Derpy. "You can't see yet, Derpy. I'm almost finished," he assured her. But she flipped open the toolbox lid and continued to ignore him. She took out a small carving knife out of the box and walked back to the blueprints. Derpy, what are you doing?" he asked, his eyes filled with curiosity. The gray Pegasus ignored her companion and held the knife with her hoof. She slowly brought it up to her right eye, the one she skewed more so than the other one. Dr. Who's eyes grew wide with shock, and he took a step toward her. "Be careful, Derpy, that knife's sharp," he spoke slowly to her, as if she was a small child and didn't understand things. She pointed the tip of her knife towards the bottom of her eye, near the tear duct. "Good," she muttered. "Derpy, no!" he screamed at her as she plunged the blade into her right eye. Her screams pierced the air and vibrated off the metallic walls and ceiling. He turned away and squeezed his eyes shut, and retched as his ears were filled with the sickening squish of Derpy's eye being severed. She continued to scream, and tears profusely ran down her face, but she didn't cease her violent actions. After a few agonizing minutes, the room filled with silence. The brown earth cult stole a glance at his partner. She had her back towards her, and he could see the blood of bits of eye pulled around her front hooves. She dropped the red-stained knife with the clatter and shoulder raised lowered with deep breaths. He heard her start to cry in pain, and he walked cautiously up to her side with hopes to comfort her. "Derpy, are you okay?" he asked quietly. She turned abruptly towards him, and he held back the scream from a gruesome sight in front of him. A gaping hole wherever her eye used to be stuck out from her face. Tears and blood streaked down her face and splattered the tips of her hooves as they fell. But the thing that held him paralyzed was her smile. The gray Pegasus had her mouth practically stitched from ear to ear in an unnerving, sadistic grin. She giggled and held her smile at her friend. "See, Hoovy?" she chattered away like an excited child. "I'm normal now." She seemed to be unaware of the pain in her head, only making it harder to pull back a shudder. He regained his composure the best he could, and he felt a few tears tickle down his cheeks as he stared at his dear companion. "Derpy, how could you?" he asked quietly, letting sympathetic tears fall from his eyes. The young Pegasus perked her ears in confusion and cocked her head to the side, not letting the horrible grin leave her face. "What do you mean, Hoovy? Now I don't look weird anymore. I'm normal! I can finally be normal! Isn't it great?" she asked happily. Dr. Hooves shook his head slowly and ripped away from her stare. "No, Derpy, you're not normal. In fact, probably more abnormal than before," he said. What do you mean?" she asked, her smile starting to deteriorate. "I don't know any pony. He only has one eye," he said. Derpy opened her mouth to object, but the words stuck in her throat, He was right. No pony only has one eye. At least, when she was wall-eyed, she still had the same amount of body parts. What have I done? She thought. Her lone eye started to tear up, and her partner walked over, resting his forehead against hers. It'll be okay, he muttered. We'll get you an eye patch, or... I don't want an eye patch! I don't want anything! I want to be normal! She screamed at him. She grabbed the discarded knife and glared menacing at the brown earth coat. And if I can't be normal, she seized, then I'll just have to make somebody like me! She yelled and stabbed Dr. Hooves in the eye, causing him to screech in pain. She turned abruptly and removed the blade and tried to stab him again. He staggered a few feet away and screamed in pain. Duppy, please stop! You can still be normal, just listen to me! He pleaded at the raging Pegasus. She screamed in anger and charged at him and lunged at the knife. But she missed her target. In her blind fury, she turned the blade over and slashed over to the left, severing the colt's esophagus. He laid there, gurgling, slightly as he drowned in his own blood. While he was down, Derpy took the short amount of time to successfully remove his right eye, just as she did hers. She huffed in a small victory, looking over at her victim. Her breathing hitched as her blood ran cold. The body of her best friend lay lifelessly in front of her, his blood seeping from the eye socket and neck. What have I done? She murmured. Then she yelled, What have I done? She sobbed into her partner's fur and started shaking feverishly. Hoovy, wake up! Wake up, Hoovy! Hoovy, wake up! She screamed and hiccuped in between her uncontrollable sobs as she continued shaking her lifeless friend. He meant the world to her. Dr. Hooves was the only pony that treated her like everyone else. When she was around him, she was normal. I'm sorry, she yelled at him, meekly hoping that her apologies would somehow bring him back to life. After an hour of sobbing, screaming, shaking, and hiccuping, Derpy managed to get up on her hooves and walk towards the doorway. Her eye caught the item on the table. She curiously walked towards the V-shaped A V-shaped object with rounded corners, and a single point was lying on the table, and a small round piece with an inverted point laid next to it. She picked up the last piece and noticed it had fit perfectly into the slot. She gasped at the item in her hooves. A heart was constructed out of pieces of wood, metal, and plastic. She turned the item over and started to break down into uncontrollable sobs again. On the back was the inscription, I love you, Derpy, written in cursive. She couldn't help but smile at the present, and she turned towards her fallen crush before muttering, I love you too.